Welcome, everyone. I'm Maria Marshall. I'm the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. Welcome to our really interesting webinar that we're going to have today, including the history of redlining and extension to conceptualize local housing policy decisions. Our speaker is going to be Craig Carpenter from Michigan State University. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics. Dr. Carpenter's extension efforts revolve around community and economic development. He develops curricula for community and regional economic workshops across Michigan to help communities identify and implement economic development opportunities. His research efforts focus on the use of federal administrative data to examine questions related to the interaction of race, ethnicity, veteran status, entrepreneurship, economic growth, and public policy. And the program he's going to be talking about today won actually two awards, the APLU's 2024 National Extension Diversity Award and NACDEP's 2024 Excellence in Teamwork National Winner. So we look forward to hearing all about the program, Craig, and the Research and Extension Program. You'll go to next. Just a reminder that our next webinar will be February 25th at 3 p.m. The discussion will be about future directions for rural population research to inform extension, findings from listening sessions. So that, of course, all our webinars are interesting. So I won't say that they'll be interesting. They're all interesting, right? So, but we look forward to having speakers from across all the Northeast and the Northeast, South, and the North Central talking about these listening sessions, which will be definitely important for the work that we're doing across all those regions. And with that, Craig, I pass it on to you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. And thank you all for joining. Definitely happy to be here and happy to talk about this work. Super excited about this project and what we've been able to do at MSU. To give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about. First, I'll just kind of talk about what is redlining, what was redlining, with the website that we created at MSU Extension that really dives into that history in more detail for the state of Michigan. We'll talk about why it still matters, what's the legacy of these policies today, and how we use this history in our housing programs in some of our housing programs at MSU Extension. And what we've seen as we've included those in our housing programs. And then I'll talk about how you could do this for your state if you're interested, and also touch on a new project we're working on, which is rural redlining. And thanks, Maria. Yeah, if any questions come up, certainly feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try and monitor that. And there'll be plenty of time at the end as well. So I'm not ignoring you if I don't respond to something right away. Will be plenty of time to talk about questions in the chat at the end. But yeah, so stepping forward, so what is redlining? So redlining was actually originally popularized in the 1960s by housing activists and equal rights activists, so before the Civil Rights Act, to describe housing discrimination by private industry. So typically this discrimination was racial, and it could be excluding whole neighborhoods or discriminating with interest rates or other mortgage terms, right, for housing. But more recently, redlining's come to typically refer back to behavior by some of the New Deal programs and the kind of redlining maps that people have come to see more. So just to take a step back, a lot of this started in FDR programs and New Deal programs in the 1930s and 40s. So many of these programs, not just housing programs, explicitly excluded or impoverished people of color. One of those programs was the FHA, which of course still exists today and does lots of work, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation bought foreclosing mortgages and issued amortized mortgages with lower interest rates to folks. And of course, amortized mortgages help facilitate wealth accumulation and housing in general. And mortgages are a huge part, especially in the United States, for how people accumulate wealth as they age. So when Holk was doing this, actually right after they did that loan program, they created what they called risk maps. So nearly all cities with population over 40,000 were redline mapped. So that's 240 cities almost. What they did is create maps, and I'll show some examples here in a moment, where they literally colored in neighborhoods on those maps, green, blue, yellow, or red. So everything from what they called best to hazardous. And what the problem was that these maps were explicitly racist in how they created those neighborhood definitions. So this was part of the federally required underwriting manual for creating these maps. So it's regardless of economic class or single family home status, government appraisers almost always colored neighborhoods as hazardous if any Black families live there, even a single Black family. And I have some quotes here from that underwriting manual that kind of go into more detail. One thing to be clear about is that HOLC, or Holk, as I'm saying, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, didn't itself deny loans to people of color in their initial rescue phase. They created these maps after that initial rescue phase. So, but what Holk did is they institutionalized these practices, right? They created these maps. They went on to share those maps with the FHA. The FHA updated, created their own maps, which again, at least in part, discriminated on the basis of race. And Holk hired thousands of local employees in these cities to help make the maps. And they even had conferences in these cities where they shared strategies for how to make these maps, to teach people how to make these discriminatory maps. So they really institutionalized this behavior of explicitly discriminating on where banks and local real estate industry would give out loans. And so this has really been put forth as a huge potential contributor to racial wealth inequality and housing inequality that we still see today. So here's an example of one of the maps. So I'm from Michigan State, so I picked the map for Lansing and East Lansing. So Michigan State is right on the right side of that map. Maybe you can read it. It says Michigan State College. And all in all, in Michigan, the government redline mapped 11 cities. So you might know Battle Creek, Bay City, Detroit, Flint, Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Lansing, Pontiac, Muskegon, Saginaw, Jackson. And as you can see from this map, it also included many of the suburbs, right? They didn't just stop at the city boundaries. So in Detroit, for example, right, Dearborn, Hamtramck, Royal Oak, where I was born in Southfield, those were all part of the Detroit redlining map. So in these maps, there's what's called area description files, where the government appraisers would go in and put their justifications as they were following their required underwriting manual. So for example, here's some grading justifications for the Kalamazoo area. So I pulled some quotes from redlined areas. And as you can see, the language and justifications are incredibly coarse and offensive. And this was what was required of the government appraisers. And so these are all available on the website for every city in Michigan, except a couple for which the area description files haven't been recovered. But we really think at MSU that it's important to remember this past, even in all of its coarseness and its offensiveness, to really fully understand the context of the housing inequality that we're confronting today. And there's other examples of discrimination, right? So redline mapping is just one example. There's lots of other examples, and our housing programs talk about those and zoning and some other ways. So in those area description files, there's an example of blockbusting. So blockbusting was racist fear-mongering that racial or ethnic minorities are going to move into an area, and they would try and get white people to move out and sell at a discounted rate, and then turn around and sell at a higher rate to people of color. And that's explicitly referenced in the area description files for Saginaw, Michigan, for example. So this is kind of the history of housing that we're still confronting and that went on over the past 100 years. So if this was in the 30s and 40s, why does it still matter today? Well, so as I mentioned, we made this website, and you can jump to it now. So the main purpose of the website is to provide this factual information to help start conversations about the injustice and the inequality that remains in Michigan cities today. And we also hope that the website will help spur kind of housing policy that pursues racial justice and housing justice for people in Michigan. So why it matters today is that Holk institutionalized these practices, as I mentioned. So in addition to hiring and collaborating with private sector groups, they had conferences kind of proselytizing these groups. And these practices were all continued until the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So there's this huge time period in which one of the main ways in which people in the United States accumulate wealth, and people of color were explicitly and deliberately excluded from that. So it has been put forward as a major contributor to racial wealth inequality. And there's new research out that shows that it certainly did, where people can take historical census data and link it to present day outcomes. And they find that children born into these red line map cities had lower incomes. Black children, I should say, born into these red line map cities had about 7% lower incomes on average, and negative effects on housing values. And white people, on the other hand, actually benefited from these redlining activities. So we do find that the black-white income gap increased by about 36%, and the wealth gap by an even larger amount, by about 80%. And we're also able to look at the children of children born into those red line map cities and can see that these wealth effects persist really strongly into those children. So it's not that long ago, right? This is the 40s and 50s. So there's plenty of people that are still alive today who were themselves redlined, and certainly their children are still alive who were redlined. And it's not just home ownership and income either. There's tons of research on negative effects of racial segregation, whether it's education, crime, health, pollution, many others. I mean, I've seen research papers that link everything from ADHD to premature birth rates to living in an area now that was previously redline mapped. So it still matters because it still matters, right? We're educating folks about inequities, and how to confront them. So we argue we should include one of the main drivers of these inequities today. In addition, on the website, I wanted to share, so we both took the historical redline map. So on the left, that's what that is. That's the original redlining map. And we overlaid a shapefile of that map on present day demographics. And for a lot of cities, it really starkly shows kind of a path dependency or a continuation of segregation. Even if these maps weren't used in that redline mapping, just showing that areas that were segregated previously are still segregated today, we think kind of emphasizes the importance of this history. And I also wanted to say that some people now deny redlining much more broadly. So, for example, Lawrence Brown, in a book called Black Butterfly, refers to redlining as an ongoing process of wealth denial practiced in Black neighborhoods across the country, so even today. So some scholars really define it more broadly about zoning and public investments and tax appraisal, even if it's not legal for those to discriminate anymore. There's some research that finds they do indeed still discriminate. Okay, so that's the history. I know I kind of flew through it, so I want to kind of acknowledge that. Trying to keep the webinar at reasonable length, so that's the main reason. But so to move on to how we use this in our housing programs at MSU. So basically, the idea is there's lots of reasons for housing inequality today, right? Income inequality, financial education inequality, zoning decisions. We talk a lot about the missing middle in Michigan. There's sort of multifamily housing and single family housing, but not a lot in between, not a lot of duplexes, not a lot of triplexes. And so the legacy of redlining is another reason why we see housing inequality today. And so we think it's kind of odd to exclude this one reason and talk about only these other reasons when we're educating our local housing planners and zoners. We have a number of housing programs at MSU, and not all of them include this history I just talked about, but some of them do, and to varying degrees. So, especially exclusive to inclusive, where we talk about zoning a lot. We also mention the history of redlining and how that kind of overlaps with the history of zoning. So it more focuses, though, on the exclusive nature of single-family residential zoning districts in Michigan, and kind of traces the history of that as a tool of racial exclusion. That is the history of zoning in Michigan. And then we overview strategies that could be used as part of housing policies that might reduce these inequalities. So, reducing single-family residential zoning districts, reducing lot size requirements. Obviously, these are just examples of policies that would have that outcome. And so we share types of policies that would, and what their effects would be based on research. We have scenario-based activities in these programs. So being from MSU, we have Spartyville as part of Extension Citizen Planner. We bring that to our housing programs. And we have some scenarios about what's going on in that community and what are some activities that folks could go through to help address those issues and how they could set goals. There's other resources that I wanted to share. And of course, feel free to reach out if you're interested in learning more about these resources, or about other housing programs at MSU if you're interested in running housing programs in your own state. We have lots of checklists, for planning for housing and implementing those plans, and some annotated kind of bibliographies of resources for different communities, because, of course, every community is unique and has its own housing needs or drivers of those housing issues. Okay, so this is great, but it seems like a lot of work. How can you do it for your state? Well, first, I want to say that we have been very successful in this. So we were invited to present this work at the Michigan State Housing Development Authority. It's basically like the HUD for Michigan. We provided certification maintenance for the American Planning Association and American Institute of Certified Planners. And it's been integrated into some other work at MSU and led to some other grants at MSU. The MISTA, the Michigan State Housing Development Group, also came forward with Michigan's first statewide housing plan, and they cited redlining as a reason for why equity and racial justice is a priority area for housing in Michigan. So it definitely helped with those connections with MISTA, and helped also us connect with regional housing groups and facilitate some regional housing plans across Michigan. And Maria earlier mentioned that we have won some awards. I'll casually brag and say that we've won more than two. So we've won one from Community Development Society and NACTEP and the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. So yeah, we have won a number of awards for these housing programs, and I would encourage you to implement it in your state as well. So if you wanted to, getting back to that, there's a phenomenal website put out by University of Richmond where they have essentially all the redlining maps that have been recovered from HOLC. And they have the original maps. And so you can download those to look at them for your state, for every city that was redline maps, probably. And they also have all the area description files. So I mentioned those. And they've already made them all into shape files. So You can even download the maps like we did, and pretty easily if you know how to use ArcGIS. So you don't have to edit any shapefiles. You can overlay those on other shapefiles that are simply available from the census and show something similar in your state of the kind of legacy of these maps on at least segregation today, or at a minimum, the continuation of segregation that existed 70 years ago. And it's also interactive. So if you went to that website right now, this slide is showing that you could click on individual neighborhoods and it'll pop up with the area description file and what those appraisers were writing about those areas. Thanks for Maria just put the link in the chat if anyone wants to jump to that website. And like I said, certainly feel free to reach out to learn more about our outreach programs, our planning programs. I mean, you can find some online, but I'll share my email at the end as well, and I can connect folks with other educators and specialists at MSU Extension and the awesome work they do, whether it's about our housing programs in general or this aspect of them. Another thing I wanted to touch on is I go over this history often when we're at programs and folks are saying, well, so this is an urban issue, and you know, even though it's a lot of the cities in Michigan at 11, there's a lot of other areas that are rural in nature, and so this doesn't really affect us. So I really want to emphasize that that's not the case. So it turns out rural redlining has been going on for a long time. So in the 1920s, there were about 1 million Black farmers in the US. And in the 2000s, there's less than 20,000 Black farmers. And new research estimates that, of course, there's less farmers in general, but if Black farmers had left agriculture at the same rate as white farmers, there would be over 10 times as many still Black farmers. So more like 300,000 instead of 20,000 Black farmers. And this area is definitely less researched, but we do know that rural redlining actually happened first. So the Federal Farm Loan Act in 1916, it was the first direct federal loan program, and its goal was similar to the housing programs, or increase credit to rural family farmers. But again, just like I mentioned with the Hulk maps, the way they appraised farm value and loan eligibility and the amount of that loan was based in part explicitly on racial and ethnic population shares in those rural areas. So they don't have the maps. So I think this has gotten kind of less famous or less the spotlights, but a similar process happened in rural areas too. And so there's no reason to think this process doesn't have the same legacy effects, or, you know, analogous legacy effects, I should say, in rural areas. And there are other rural programs as well, right? Just like there's the FHA, there was the FMHA, or the Farmers Home Administration, that operated for a long time, and it subsidized housing, and it similarly discriminated against Black families. It directly rejected loans to Black people who tried to vote sometimes or participate in the civil rights movements. And at the same time, it was investing in white-only swimming pools and white-only golf courses, so segregated rural amenities in the South. So we're continuing to research in this area, but I like to emphasize that it's not just urban areas where this discrimination is going on. And of course, even more recently, this is less to do with housing and more with farming. But, you know, the USDA was found guilty of discrimination against Black farmers as recently as 1996. So even though I don't like to admit how long ago 1996 was, now that I'm in my 30s, but it's not that long ago. So I think it's important to emphasize that, that rural areas also experience these issues, and it's important to think about them in rural areas as well. So I know I flew through a lot of that history. So like I said, I'm happy to answer any questions, but with that, I'll conclude and say thank you.
Thanks, Craig. I think we have some comments and questions in the chat. But before you even start that, I'm wondering, can you talk about how you are actually incorporating this history into the extension, the housing programs?
Can we talk more about how we use the history in the housing programs?
Right.
Yeah, so we spend a lot of time, as I mentioned, talking about reasons for housing inequalities, right? Of course, local data collection is part of that. I mentioned missing middle, excuse me, is a common thing we're finding in Michigan, where there's just not enough housing supply in Michigan areas, or we look at occupations in certain areas and the salaries those bring in relative to the housing supply. And so as part of that context, we include this history of discrimination. Um, a lot of areas in Michigan still have racial inequalities in housing access. And one of the key drivers of that is the history of discrimination in housing, among all those other reasons. So when we're giving that context, we include this history. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Other questions? So I'm looking at the chat now. So one of the questions is, in taking steps towards addressing this issue in positive ways, does this start at the city level, state level, government level, federal, program, agency level, or all of the above equally? So it's a great question. And I'm not sure. So in extension, we share this context and this information, and we share policy options. And we think it's really important to understand this context and history before you make the policy decisions. But of course, we're not advocating for particular policies from MSU Extension. We're trying to just make sure folks have all the information they need to make an educated decision for their local zoning, for example, or local planning group or state level planning group. So maybe that doesn't quite answer the question.
So who usually, when you're talking, is it city planners that you're usually presenting to and presenting some of this information to, and that kind of bubbles up from there?
Yeah, so yeah, city planners, local community planning groups, zoning. In Michigan, we have zoning groups that are at the local level, so we'll present to those groups. Sometimes it's kind of an economic development corporation that has a housing aspect, because like a lot of areas in the US, housing is a big issue in Michigan. So it's, kind of expanding more generally. So when we're brought in to talk about housing generally in those programs, we'll also talk about this. I see a question from Bridget as well, linking to a paper about research that associates things from the Hulk maps to things I mentioned, like health or inequalities that exist in neighborhoods today. And I think that is super important. That's why I mentioned that Hulk itself didn't use those maps to discriminate. So research that just overlays the maps and finds associations aren't necessarily causal in nature, but there is causal research. There's a recent article out in Journal of Economic Literature that uses some fun techniques to get at causal effects of the maps. And there's a couple other papers. There's one in one of the American economic journals. I'm writing a paper right now that takes advantage of the 40,000 population cutoff to look at discrimination on either side of those. So it is important, even though I think it is important to understand that some of this research is associative and non-causal, there's also causal research about the effect of HOLC, even if it's not necessarily about the neighborhoods on those maps. HOLC did institutionalize this discriminatory behavior in private industry, and FHA continued to engage in some of that discrimination. Let's see, were there other questions? Maria, I see you have a question. Do you have suggestion on how to implement the program given how some states and now federal government's position against DEI programming. Yeah, it's not DEI programming. So it's one of the reasons we see housing inequality. And it's weird to bury our head in the sand and not talk about it. It's not just about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's about understanding why there's housing inequality in cities before making decisions about how to address that housing inequality. So we don't frame it as just something we're doing for DEI reasons. We see it as an integral part, because it is an integral part of why there's housing inequality, as an integral part of educating and contextualizing housing policy decisions. Does that kind of answer your question, Maria? Certainly.
Yes, somebody had privately messaged me asking about that.
Okay.
And I think you just got one more question.
Is redlining in cities and homelessness totally independent of each other, or are there parallels between these two? Wow, that's a great question. I mean, certainly they're not independent, right? Homelessness is related to, at least in part, to housing prices and housing accessibility. And so, sorry, I lost your question with Michael. So, and housing accessibility in part is affected by the history of redlining. So certainly they're not totally independent. I'm not familiar with any research that tries to directly connect the two. I wouldn't be surprised if it exists, but I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer for it beyond that. I'm looking at this from Michael Wilcox. It looks like he's got some, yeah. Thanks, Michael. Details on more recent discrimination for where local economic development funding, or maybe I shouldn't say discrimination necessarily, inequalities in where local economic development funding is flowing. Any other questions? All right, well, if not, so like I said, feel free to reach out. My email's right there. Thank you all so much for joining. Maria, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, just a reminder of our February webinar. Usually okay, there you go. I know Shelley usually puts it in there. And that today's webinar is recorded and will be on our YouTube channel. You'll still get an email from us about this. And we look forward to seeing you in February to talk about what they found in the listening session. Thank you so much, Craig.
Thanks.